We just wanted to do a quick recap of the first session, because we'll be building on that, revisiting some of that through. Go ahead, Nicole.
Yeah, and thank you all for coming today. How many of you went to session one? And yeah, okay, great. So for those of you who missed session one, the presentation focused a lot on art writing in the most traditional sense, in terms of focusing on process, materials, context, who made it, why, and how. It also looked at the fact that content is adaptable no matter what kind of vehicle it's being placed in, right? So whether you're writing an artist bio or a statement or working on social media or PR, if you have a kind of boilerplate that you created, you can adapt that to all of these different purposes and pull from it continuously. And then they spoke a little bit about how criticism goes further by analyzing the formal and the technical. So criticism is not just talking about what you see, but also questioning whether what you're looking at actually worked in addressing the message it wants to address. So that's pretty much it.
Okay, actually, I did have a question too. How many of you here are artists interested in learning how to professional writing for grants and stuff like that? How many of you are here interested in art writing in terms of art criticism? Okay. It's just an important, I wanted to know, what additional commentary to make. That's good. Thanks.
Awesome.
How do you write with intention? So one of the things that Nicole and I went over, we wanted to have more of a dialogue, so it's a little bit more dynamic. And we wanted to have questions that we asked each other, because we found ourselves having an interesting dialogue about the differences and the different views that we had over this. And we wanted to bring that over as a way of expanding your way of thinking about this.
Right. Yeah, so when Laurie and I first started planning about what we would talk about today, we realized that we both have very different processes with how we approach the way that we write. And so for me, before I sit down to write, I actually do a lot of pre-writing in my head. So a lot of the writing that I'll do will be like a profile on an artist or a review of an exhibition, but it'll also be, kind of more technical types of writing, like grant writing or press release writing, right? And the grant writing and the press release writing is definitely a lot more formulaic. But in either case, I'm always pre-writing in my head. And what I mean by that is, I wake up in the morning and I give a few minutes to think about the writing that I know is coming up on my plate. Or I, am thinking about it while I'm doing another kind of mindless task, like sending emails. A lot of times that pre-writing ends up being little notes that I leave myself literally on my iPhone notepad. And they're usually not well-developed thoughts. They're just, I've been thinking about this. This is more or less what I know I want to say, but I know that I have to drill down on this a little bit more. I think that for me, that process is really important because it lets me work things out in my head without feeling like I'm committing to any one idea, but it also allows me to identify which ideas are the really, really good ones. Because sometimes they start as one thing and they evolve in my brain because I'm sitting and I'm thinking about it for a lot of time. And so I think my takeaway for you guys for that is, start thinking, assigning yourself a deadline, I think, is really a wise approach, no matter what you're trying to write. Because when you have a deadline, imaginary or real, you can kind of start way in advance thinking about what you want to do. And I think that is, depending on what type of person you are, I think that's really, really helpful. Deadlines are how I operate on all things. I'm on this deadline right now, so just kind of plowing through it, right? And then after I've done all that pre-writing and I've started taking a lot of notes, I always make an outline, especially for longer pieces. And so what an outline would look like for me is I would kind of start with the notes would be bullet points, and I would start with kind of like the overarching umbrella of what each paragraph should include. And I break it up into paragraphs because I think that paragraphs are really digestible for people who are not experienced writers to say, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write a piece of text that literally looks like 7 lines on a Word document, right? It's not intimidating. It's just something that you know that you can do. And so an outline helps because when you start writing, you're not coming to it cold. You're saying, in this paragraph, I'm going to talk about this. And when I'm making that outline, I'm thinking about the progression of what I'm going to write. And so whether you're writing an artist profile or an exhibition review or a grant, all of these types of writing share one thing in common, which is that you need to make sure that people can understand one thing because they've already understood another, right? Like, you're not just kind of telling a story or painting a picture in boxes that don't really make sense or in an order that doesn't really make sense. Like, you're thinking about it from the approach of, how is this person going to understand what I'm saying? Because it's in some way, shape, or form a logical progression of the story I'm trying to tell. Like, just like the plot of a movie, you know what I mean? Even if it's not a novel, when you think about writing, you have to think about it from that perspective of drawing it out in a way that makes sense to the other person. So after I've outlined, after I've thought about the progression of that outline, I start writing. And at this point, it's just putting everything onto the page. I'm sometimes thinking about style and prose. I mean, that's always there, right? But I'm also not putting any pressure on myself because I'm saying to myself, this is not my last draft. This is my first draft. And that first draft is crucial because it's the hardest part. Like, getting everything onto the page that you want to get onto the page, for me, is the hardest part because it's the biggest labor because you want to make sure that you're articulating your ideas right. And after that, I leave and I go for a walk. Or, a metaphorical walk. Like, I just don't look at it for a while.
Yeah, take the break. Take the break
Yeah,
is important.
take the break. And then I come back and I start working on it line by line. So that was my monologue. Yes.
Okay. So I do a lot of different types of writing. Sometimes I have to do interviews with a lot of people. Sometimes it's a quick review that I have to turn out. Sometimes it's an in-depth essay that I want to write because of the passion for it. But I also write for a lot of different publications. And one of the things that I think are essential in sort of, if you're a freelance writer, is that, like, you really do build relationships with different publications that have different audiences. And even the editors are different in what they want for the particular section or for the particular commission that they're giving you. So I'm constantly thinking about audience in my mind. It's like one of the first things that, like, who is this going to be read by? What do I need to convey to this audience based on the commission that I've received? And so, audience in mind, and I also think that intention with regards to, like, I assess my intention with the piece with regards to that audience. So if I'm writing for a very niche art criticism publication, I have very few specific people in my mind that I'm writing to, and that helps me because I'm writing to a specific audience. But if I'm writing to a very, very large professional oral audience like the art newspaper, it's a very different approach. So thinking about intention with regards to today, I thought about, like, the why. Like, so what is the purpose of the piece? Are you informing? Are you reflecting? Right? Are you trying to persuade someone to give you a grant? Are you entertaining people to get them to go to an event? Right? All of these sort of, like, questions you must ask yourself when you're approaching writing, because these questions help you think about the style, the language, the sentence structure that you, or even the structure of the whole piece that you should consider with regard to that. Is it going online? Is it going to go in print, right? Like, it does change a little bit how, or should make you reflect a little bit on how to approach the piece, the intention of that piece. And how? You're going to hear this a million times, but it's because it's worth saying. Clarity is essential in whatever piece of writing you do, right? Especially if you're doing grant writing, especially if you're doing any sort of journalistic writing where it's online and people's attentions really last less than 10 seconds. You have to get there really, really quickly and stay clear. And so that's why your audience is keep it in your mind and seek for clarity. And right, because the how is strategic about your language. For example, like my first few months at the art newspaper, I worked briefly at the art newspaper for about a year and a half when I lived in London. And I had just finished my master's thesis, which was a 65-page thesis on art criticism. And then but I had a master's in journalism, but I needed, and my first few months at the art newspaper, it was amazing, but they just cut out entirety of my voice. It was like a very important thing when you become a journalist. You need to write for a mass audience. You cannot use art speak. You have to use very different sentence structures. So like, it was like a very interesting thing just thinking about clarity and like cutting all inessential words and getting there. So that's why like it's different audience depending on what you're doing, then different language, different sentences. And I also think that one of the challenges, like one of the things that we thought, like we're in a particular stage in our writing careers, if you can call it that like you really, like this question of voice becomes important, and we're gonna talk about it. But also like really becoming confident in what you know. Another of those like key phrases that you keep hearing that it's really important is like trust what you know, write what you know. And like it is like true because you have to build a sort of kind of confidence and trust what you know. I have more about that coming up, but we can go next, or you can respond.
Well, I want to kind of respond with trust what you know, because I think as writers, trusting what you know is essential at the beginning, but once you trust yourself in your writing process, you can kind of write about anything you want. And I think that's like important to remember, because there are types of writing that I have not attempted because I'm afraid of the volume and the magnitude of it, but I know that I can do it. I just haven't sat and done it because I've been writing for long enough to know what my voice is, what my approach is, and how I would tackle that. And I just want to hit on Laurie's point about clarity being so essential, and I think it goes hand in hand with knowing your audience. A lot of you write grants, and a lot of artists approach me about helping them with grants, and I see very often the kinds of same mistakes get made, which is that it's obvious that you don't feel confident about addressing the questions that the grant is asking because you only feel confident talking about your work. And I think that the number one thing to remember when grant writing is that you have to answer the questions being asked. Like, don't step outside the lines. Don't talk about your work in ways that they aren't necessarily interested in. And especially if it's project-based grant, like you're making a proposal for an object or an exhibition, you need to speak in the most practical terms possible. Like, this is how many works are included, this is how I'm gonna build them, this is, kind of the concept behind it without too much art speak. This is, where the money's gonna come, like this is how your money will be used. All of that stuff is very, very important to grantors, because if you think about it, like, why would they give you money to do something if you can't even write about it, right? You can't even articulate it. So I think that's important to kind of hone in on. So our key takeaways, for me, it's once you have an idea in your head, map it on paper before you start writing each sentence. Yeah.
Yeah, meaning another approach, like quick approach that I do if I'm writing an art review and I really haven't had a lot of time to think about it. Like that's what I didn't talk about actually. Like I have a very different process, but I actually go by hand, grab my notepad, grab my pen, and I said like, what are the 5 things that I must say in this piece? Just like get little concise nuggets that I'm like, what are the 5 things that I want to get through in this piece? 5 sentences. Sometimes one of those is more than 1 sentence, but like that like is what then I return to as I then switch to my computer and start writing and working from the first sentence onwards. But I think another way of thinking about this description is also it's sort of like things to keep in mind when you're describing a project, especially for if you're doing a grant, or really if you're trying to write a review of a show as well, right? Like cause and effect, like keep like that dynamic in mind. Like it's not just cause and effect. What is the relationship of these 2 elements in the work that you might be writing about? Also general to particular. Some people love, like you can enter a review, you can enter for focusing, zooming in on a very particular element of the work and then zooming out to something that's very general about that general experience of the work, or you can do it the other way around, right? Mm-hmm. You can begin with the general and then give a sort of a very particular detail. So those are other two ways that I wanted to put up, like cause and effect and general particular as things to keep in mind when you're writing.
So overcoming writer's block, which is probably something, if you aren't very experienced with writing, you would struggle with. And so, Laurie, I want to hear about how you overcome writer's block.
Yeah, this has actually happened to me at several stages of my life, and I've actually I prefer books about overcoming writer's block over books about like how to do grant writing. I feel like every book about grant writing that I've ever bought has been completely useless. Really, like don't waste your money. Like what you actually have to do, because it's that research stage that you get, you're obsessed and you're like, you need a lot of input in order to get, and then you get stuck. I've gotten stuck. One of the terms for it is, of course, perfectionism. Like you have like this idea that you can't execute. Another term of it is resistance. You have certain kinds of fear of failure, or even fear of success, that like kind of like block you from getting there. And I love this phrase. You can't go from 0 to hero overnight, right? If you have wasted, if you've wasted your time procrastinating and you've waited until the last day, like you're gonna be in panic mode. Your adrenaline is going to be insane. You're not gonna be able to be calm and zen to get those ideas out. So 2 things that I have tried that like are my tried and true things that I go back to, right? Key ways of breaking procrastination and paralysis is free writing habit. So one of the books that I read, which was like a random one, really had me like doing timed exercise of free writing. What is free writing? You literally just write whatever is in your head. I've literally written out, I'm sitting in the room unsure what to write about, but like that little psychological moment, you're like, I'm just gonna write for 10 minutes. And your task is just to sit and put like your fingers on the keyboard and start writing for 10 minutes. And you have a timer and you walk away and you don't think about grammar, you don't think about sentence structure, you don't think about spelling, you're just like letting it come out, whatever it is that you want to write about. Now, you can do that then, right? If you're really trying, like if the writer's block has gotten really intense, right? You have to do that every day. And then after a few days, 3 or 4 days, maybe you can go up to 20 minutes, right? And so my point is that you're not gonna get to like from 0, from being able to write like fear of like the empty page to writing for 3 hours overnight. You have to build that up. If you're really stuck in a writer's block moment, you have to build it up through free writing. You get really comfortable with that mode. Now, at some point, you can start seeing that like the idea is coming out and you can like go, and I've done like intense free writing session of like 45 minutes. This is another book that I read that I really loved. And like basically I just reread that 45-minute rant and find the one good idea that came out of it. I grab that good idea the next day and I go and I do another 45 minutes just on that one sentence that I grabbed a highlight, and then I build on that. and then I build on that, and then eventually I'm getting to the point where I can write for 3 hours, or I can, at some point, like I remember my master's thesis, I was like 65 pages, I completely gone over, but I was so in a role that I could write 60 pages more in 2 weeks, right? Like it is like this habit of free writing that got me to the point where I can write for 9 hours a day, like in a thesis, right? And that's like the habit of like, and sometimes even with the thesis, when I was already writing, I would still go in and do my little 10-minute free write, just to like get the juices flowing. So that's like one of my methods that I really, really love.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
When you say you write for 9 hours straight, I'm very curious about this, like, because I'll sit and write for a full day as well, but I take a lot of breaks. Like, do you take a lot of breaks?
Sorry, this is like, actually, I do mention it later, but I continue to do timed. I time myself. I do the Pomodoro method. You can do it on your phone. You can do it on a screen. You can just get a kitchen timer, whatever works for you. I do 20 minutes, 5-minute break. And this is where nothing gets me into the flow better than doing 20 minutes, get up, 5-minute break, walk around. I usually would go have a cigarette, like go back, sit down, try for 20 minutes more, and you do 4 sprints of that. Then you take a half an hour break, or you go get lunch, or you go food and then talk to a friend, make a call, and then you get back, but you go back to that 20-minute sprint, and then 5-minute break, 20-minute, and that really is like when I have to like really like if I'm a little like, oh my god, I have this big deadline, this big piece, like I do the timed exercises with breaks, and that always gets me through.
Yeah. And I'm not as methodical as Laurie. I'm more like, I'm really like onto the paragraph thing, right? So like I'll say to myself like, I'm gonna write the first 2 paragraphs and then I'm gonna take a break. And I think that what we both have in common is that we're just approaching it like from this very like no pressure place. Like no pressure, just gonna write a couple paragraphs, just gonna write for 20 minutes, and then I'm gonna do something else, and like if it's not that good, that's okay. Like we have in the resources section later on in this presentation a talk that Ta-Nehisi Coates gave, like a video he did for The Atlantic a couple years ago, where he talks about writing being just like the absolute most soul-crushing work that one could possibly do. And when I saw this video, I was like, oh, awesome, like I'm not alone, because I really like writing is this kind of thing, and I'm not a visual artist, so I really don't know. I think you guys are way braver than writers, by the way. But I just feel like when you sit down to write, it just feels like this insurmountable thing that you just cannot manage every single time. Even when you know what you want to write, even when you're really passionate about what you're going to write about, it just feels like, oh God, I have to do this, and I don't know, there's just a lot of anxiety and fear around the process. And so I think it's nice to tell you guys that, because if you feel it, you just know that every single other person doing any writing pretty much in the world feels the same way.
Yeah, no, meaning the hardest thing was my master's thesis, which was very, like, as you can see from the title, it was like, the
what I'm writing about is dead.
Exactly, and I really care about it, and I was really passionate, and I wanted to make like this mega like thing that was going to be groundbreaking, and like that could be that sort of perfectionism, wanting to be very ambitious on something, can actually also be paralyzing. So that's why like easing into it is actually one of the best ways to go about it, and then the juices flow.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so the second important thing that I wanted to do that causes paralysis is that you go into this intense research phase where you just want to read, watch every movie. I'm very visual, so I like watching documentary. Like I just dig through, I pull up books, I start ordering books on Amazon, like they start arriving. Like it is an important phase, the input, right? Input, everyone needs input, and like, but you also need to know when to stop and realize that you get this mindset where like you don't know enough. Mm-hmm. I don't know enough. I don't know enough. I don't know enough. But in fact, what you're doing is delaying the fact of what you actually need to do. Your task is to write. So it's being aware that there's a stage that is input and there's a stage that must turn to output is what I like. And in certain periods of my life as freelance, I would make sure that I would have like my hour of power, like an hour of reading in the morning, 11 to 12. That's my morning in Berlin. Those were my mornings in Berlin, 11 to 12. But I would like just have a solid hour that I knew I was reading, and making sure then I would I would go on a walk and I would start writing in the afternoon. I have my magic hour for writing is 2 to 5. Like that's where I do deep work. So I have a very different thing. I try not to think about the piece too much in other things, but I try to go and do the sort of deep work in these like 3-hour stints. Like that's what I try to do. But I have a moment of input in the morning. So then when I sit down to write, I'm not thinking about like, I need to go grab this book and read this thing and blah, blah, blah. Then, so that's whether or not you have like 2 weeks where you're taking input, no, and time it and say like it's 2 weeks, I'm taking notes, and then there's 2 weeks that I'm gonna now write this thing. So whether it's a daily ritual where you do input and output, or you do a period of where it's input and then a period that it's output, be aware that you have to have that break.
Yeah.
And just start writing.
Yeah, and just to like respond to Laurie, like I'm very much input output, but not once I'm writing. Like once I'm writing, I'm not doing any more research. That's what the outline kind of portion of my writing is for. Like if I'm writing the outline and I have a question and I can't answer it and I need to do research, like that's the stage that it happens in. The writing is just the writing, no more research, no more input, just straight up, here's what I'm doing. And I also want to touch on your magic hour, because I was going to bring that up, like when it comes to writer's block in particular. It's important to know when you're going to be doing your best writing. Like Laurie is 2 to 5. I would say I'm first thing in the morning, and I'm not even a morning person, but I think that it's like, if I don't sit down and start writing immediately, like before everything else, you know, after coffee and breakfast, but then it's like I'm sitting down and I'm doing the work, I will get distracted. I really have to just sit down, start writing, go to lunch, you know, go through lunch, have lunch, and then I usually find that after I've had lunch, I'm just kind of tapering down. So ideally, I've done that kind of bulk writing, putting it all on the page before lunch, and then after lunch is the editing phase.
Yeah, so just be aware of your own rhythms, your own daily rhythms, and like try to adapt your writing time to what fits best for that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, go for it.
No, how do you overcome writer's block?
Okay, so I had this question for you too, Laurie. Like, when did you first start writing? When did you realize like writing was something you wanted to do?
That's very cute. I actually got a bachelor's in fine arts from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, SAIC, and I was a photographer. And I found myself enjoying a lot more the process of the research and the writing, the classes that I was taking, history of photography, critical theory. I found myself actually spending more time in those writing pieces, those essays, and enjoying that more and becoming more invested in that than in the actual work itself. So it was undergrad when I started really.
But even before that, I'm talking like.
No, I'm a late bloomer.
Okay.
I'm a late bloomer. I'm very much a late bloomer in a lot of aspects of my life. Yeah, so I like, my mom has a few like things that I wrote like in my father's typewriter when I was a kid that she saved, like funny little things. But really, like I had like crisis about like, am I gonna become a writer? But it was in my 20s.
Right. Okay. So I've been writing, like I have records of my writing since I'm 6-7 years. Since I learned to write, I've had records of me journaling my thoughts. And I think that a large part of why I've innately written since childhood is because I loved reading as well. So like Saturday mornings, I would read books and eat popcorn instead of movies. And writing was something that I think was very therapeutic for me, even as a child. I was a very emotional and sensitive kid. And so writing was like it was a place for me to kind of channel all of that. And so whenever I think about writer's block, I think about a journaling practice and a reading practice, because when you read other people's work, it sparks ideas in you, right? It's the same as watching a film or seeing an exhibition. When you see other people's ideas, the goal is that they trigger ideas in you, right? I think that's why most people create, to trigger ideas, to trigger conversations. And so reading for me is very, very important when I'm feeling stuck, because it inspires me to find that new direction. And journaling is the same. So I've had this journaling practice for, my entire life. I would say that once I started writing professionally, I really kind of let it drop to the wayside, and I don't journal as often. But when I recently the other day was like, I used to have that blog, and I went to my old, I found the address and I went to the things that I was writing about, and this was before anyone had ever published my work, right? So it was really just a journal of my thoughts on different topics, and I think this kind of is a good segue into the voice conversation. But I realized that in so journaling, I remembered things that I had completely forgotten about, and that sparks you in a new direction as well. So having that journaling practice, especially when it's specific to you and is really, really important for you as artists, writers, because you're going to be writing about yourself predominantly, right? So try and think of a way to incorporate journaling. And if you don't know what you want to journal about, you can literally just journal about what you did that day, what you worked on that day, who you saw. Did you see a friend? Did you guys have an interesting conversation? Did you go into a friend's studio? Did you see some crazy driver do some crazy ass shit on the road? Whatever it is that you saw, just do it. And then the last kind of thing with writer's block, and I think this is, especially for me when I'm doing profiles or exhibition reviews, is that it's hard to have writer's block when you're literally tasking yourself with writing about something that you have actually experienced. So, it's a little bit, I think it's a little bit more challenging to start writing a novel, right? But if you say to yourself, I really want to practice writing, I really want to get better about talking about my own work, I'm going to go see a show, or I'm going to talk to one of my artist friends, and I'm going to, approach it like an interview. And then after that interview, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write about it. That might be a really good kind of exercise for you to get comfortable with writing.
Funny, I didn't start journaling until about 5 years ago. It was more the moment that I started asking myself, what's my voice? I had had a certain kind of writing for a long time, which was art criticism, and then I had become a journalist, so I had to wipe out any sense of a voice from my writing in order to become a journalist. And so, but I wanted to go back to what I was really passionate about, criticism, and I used journaling, but I'm more of the end of day routine, and I even have 2 journals now. I used to have notes for everything, but it was classes, things that I go like this. Oh, how we're doing time?
10 minutes.
Okay. I'll just try to wrap up that point. But it became more of a moment for me to seek out my voice, the journaling, the evening, the end of day, that happened much later in my life. I used the free writing to break writer's block. I used the journaling to think more about what my voice and my concerns, and therapeutically a lot. It really started happening when I started doing therapy, which is very useful for that as well.
Right. Okay, so some key takeaways, Laurie.
Free write.
Yeah. For me, it's, experience an interview to get out of your head and into someone else's, and trust your knowledge on the topic, and take breaks.
Yeah.
Switch it up.
Take breaks.
Is it my turn to ask you first?
I think we have to see which slide is next.
How did you find your voice? Yeah,
okay.
That's me.
Yeah.
Okay. So earlier I mentioned that I started blogging before I was a professional writer. And something that I think a lot of writers find is that when they go back to writing that they finished years ago, they're really embarrassed by it. And that's definitely true of this writing. But when I went back to it, I saw that there was a skeleton of the approach to my writing that I think is still there today. And I think it's funny that Laurie talks about, the art newspaper kind of cutting out your voice. They do. They cut out your whole voice. And then there are other publications like Hyperallergic that really kind of encourages your voice and your prose. And so I think that I started finding my voice, again, first by reading my favorite writers. And so when there were pieces that I read that I really wanted to emulate, I kind of looked at that text and approached it as like, what is it about this that I really like, right? And for me, it was communicating how it made me feel to see this or to experience this. And those feelings, I think, when they're kind of drawn out in my voice, have to do with like contextualizing it in time or in phenomenons that occur around me or in nature, or just kind of like thinking about my voice as being something that can both illustrate but also perhaps find some emotion within you. And I think that when you kind of put it all together, you know, when I talk about my experience with writing and how I've been doing it since I'm a kid, and it was an emotional kind of outlet for me, or a way to kind of process my emotions or get them out, then the fact that my voice seeks to find emotion, I think, makes a lot of sense, right? So I think finding your voice is both an ongoing exercise, but it's also a historical reflection of who you are and what you have kind of always identified as your creative process. Another big one, and I know we both agree with this one, is that you should find editors that you trust to read and shape your work. I don't think my voice would have been as easily found unless I had editors being like, this doesn't make any sense. What are you trying to say? This is how you should say it. And like literally teaching me how to reshape the words so that now they make sense to a reader. And it goes the other way too with compliments, right? Like when I've had editors say, wow, I really like the way you wrote that. Wow, that's like a nice turn of phrase. That sparked a lot of confidence in me to understand, like, these are the kinds of things that people like to read. And then, of course, practice. Like, when I first started writing, like when I was a baby writer and I was like writing for the New Times about art, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. This is garbage. Everything I'm doing is garbage. But over time, from doing it more often and gaining the confidence of bigger commissions and so on and so forth, now when I approach writing, I'm not as like, this is gonna suck. I know exactly what my process is gonna be to get it out there. And even though it's still a challenging exercise, at least I have the confidence to know, like, I've done this before 100 times, and I'm gonna do it again, and it's going to be fine.
Definitely.
What about you, Laurie? How'd you find your voice?
Can you do the next slide? Yes. So it does take 10,000 hours to kind of thing to build writing. Practice makes perfect is true. Again, you're not going to go from zero to hero overnight. It's taken me 2 decades. But I used the pandemic to do a lot of experimental writing. Some of it I didn't publish, but I had already my editor friends, or co-writers, meaning we tried not to make it co-writing, but we ended up doing a lot of co-writing. This is particularly for the people that I work with in Cesura. And I found myself writing much more reflective, reverie-esque, thinking about the essay as a way in which to get myself to thinking. Like, I like using writing, particularly if it's like more of a critical kind of writing, to have that process itself be where I do my thinking. Like, writing as a tool for thinking is really important. And so experimenting with different genres, with different things, like at some point, meaning I didn't even publish this because I was too embarrassed, but I used like sort of my post-divorce, like dating Berlin, crazy Berlin nightlife as like a place where I was like really reflecting on what that moment in my life was about. And I went back and I read Anais Nin, and I was just like feeding from like, because one of the hardest things to ever write about without making it cheesy is to write about sex. And so it's like this like, but it was what allowed me to like push my boundaries, right? To get something that's like, it's uncomfortable to talk about. It's like you read like cheesy sexual writings and it's just so cringe. But I still used it to experiment, to think about language differently, to think about what the certain kinds of experiences are. So experiment. And I think I've said most of these things. Just ask yourself, what are concerns are you returning to, right, in that experimentation? What are your strengths as a writer? And that, based on the editorial feedback that you have, I have like writings, and then I would get on the phone with my editor and just like talk a little bit about like what he thought was good, what what maybe needs a little bit of work, maybe where to push further. So find friends, colleagues, and mentors for feedback, and make that like a sort of a lifelong relationship that you have if you become a writer. Like that's really essential.
Yeah, and like just touching on what you said about writing about sex, and like you can read Anais Nin, or you can read, I don't know, what's that lady that wrote Sex and the City? Like like finding the types of writers that you would rather sound like is like a part of this, right? Because and it's good to read them both, so you know what you like and what you don't like. But yeah, there's Anais Nin, and then there's other people writing about sex. Okay, so key takeaways. Don't be afraid to lean on other writers and editors for feedback. And definitely read and then practice writing in your favorite style of prose.
And experiment. Don't be afraid of failure or success, right? There's fear of failure, and there's also fear of success. Both can actually paralyze you. So like you gotta like just get comfortable with writing, get comfortable with being uncomfortable in that situation, but don't think too much about like that one piece of writing being the thing that makes or breaks your career.
Yeah. Okay, so practical tips and advice. For you.
Yeah, this is my favorite phrase for writers. Get comfortable with shitty first drafts. Really get comfortable. Like your first draft is not like ever going to be good. And shitty first draft, second, third, fourth, like really, there's gonna be a session on editing, so that's why we're not touching on it, but I just wanted to stress that. Seek out readers, we say. This is one key one in the world of today. Being pithy and concise formulations are really good, but I would say keep the hot takes for social media. I find that a lot of, meaning that's a personal opinion thing, but I find that a lot of like hot take culture has entered critical art writing, and I find it a little difficult because you do want to, I personally consider art criticism as a place to do in-depth thinking and reflection.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, intros, capture your reader with a short and punchy first sentence. Always go back after you've written the thing, re-edit. I've had school assignments where they made us write 20 versions of the first sentence, and it was amazing because you do realize that there's multiple ways you can enter a subject to catch that thing that just resonates the strongest with you. Rewrite it 10 times, like really try that, especially for grant writing. Make sure that your first sentence is short and punchy, no more than 22 words. Really try to go for like 10 to 12, to be honest, like 10 to 15. Don't only stick to description and context. I think especially this is for those who want to do art writing or critical art writing. Consider the overall aesthetic experience. What are you experiencing and feeling and thinking about when you're encountering an artwork? Right? So if you're doing critical work, I really think that it's like I really believe in sort of the Kantian experience of art, that it's about your subjectivity, what you're thinking about and reflecting. So that's where trusting your instincts really is important, and thinking about that, what are you experiencing with the work? That would be like, so it's what is that aesthetic experience that the artwork, that object is producing in you subjectively, like thinking about that.
Yeah, and when you're writing about your own work, it's thinking about what would you, if you could control what a viewer feels and thinks when they look at your work, what would that feeling and thought be?
What about you?
Oh, for me, so don't neglect the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, and why. It's super basic, and it's like a very, very basic journalism 101 type of thing, but it's, especially when I read artist work, it's kind of crazy to me how often like that is overlooked. So never forget, tell me who you are, tell me what you're making, tell me where you're making it, tell me when you made it, and tell me why you made it. Sometimes I think that if you approach your writing as artists in like a formula, I'm going to talk about my materials, I'm going to talk about my process, and I'm going to talk about the subject matter, then it's a lot easier for you to actually put something together that's cohesive. So, maybe literally write a header that says materials, and then you write, I work with blank material, and the meaning I assign to that material is blank, and kind of repeat this, right, with all your materials. Same with process. Like, first I conduct research at this place, and then I take all of my research and I distill it into XYZ, pre-work, sketches, whatever, and then I start painting, or then I start making sculpture, and if there are multiple steps, and literally just go step by step, what is a day in the life of you making this work? And I touched on this earlier, but it is worth stressing again. When writing on a prompt, like a grant, think very critically about exactly what they're asking for, and then deliver that, no more, no less. Especially with grant writing, there's always a word count. It's not a place to spend a lot of time talking about something that they haven't directly asked you. So those are kind of my biggest takeaways.
I think that's our wrap up. Yeah.
Yep.
Be descriptive, stick to the 5 W's, pay attention to the prompt, keep the audience in mind, trust and reward the process. This is an important thing. Also, when you are actually advancing, trust the process and reward the process. It helps boost your dopamine if you give yourself a little reward.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be a chocolate, but a little dance. I like my little happy. I'm and then I go back to writing, but reward the fact that you are in there when you're in there.
There's a reason that writers have vices.
Exactly.
Edit aggressively, definitely. I think we both do that to a large extent. And use a thesaurus. I love this one because I use mine all the time.
I have 3 thesauruses on my bookmarks, but I have one. Power thesaurus is the one that I've been using a lot more. I use it a lot because you end up repeating a lot of words when you're writing, and you need to go back and be like, I've said expand too many times. What's another word?
Correct. Yeah.
And I every single piece of writing that I do, I use a thesaurus when I go into editing.
Yeah, whenever I see that I've repeated a word twice, I just go, ugh, I hate it. And when in doubt, use strong verbs.
Yeah, sorry, that was also mine. If you're thinking about the sentence and you're not sure where to, add too many adjectives is not good, especially for grant writing. Focus, if you want to make a sentence stronger, one easy way is to think about that verb. And is that the strongest possible verb to make the point across? That's one key thing to go to. Look not at the adjectives, but look at the verb of the sentence.
Yeah, and actually one thing that I didn't mention that I feel like I should is wordiness. I struggled with wordiness. I still struggle with wordiness. And there's this Abraham Lincoln quote about if you're about being verbose that I can't remember, but it's something to the effect of if your letter is long or something like this, then you've written a bad letter. I don't know. I'll find it and I'll share it in a better way. But, really pay attention to something that a lot of people do, and I myself do, is you, instead of going right to the verb, right to the thing that you're going to do, you'll say something like, is attempting to do this. And that's a huge one in art writing, right? Laurie's work attempts to break down the notions of, and it's how many words did you just say? Just say Laurie's work breaks down blank, right? So pay attention to those little kind of wordiness things, and it's probably a confidence thing. Why can't you just say you do it, right? So that was one of my last takeaways.
I think
Yeah.
that's good. I think the it's passive versus active voice.
Yeah.
So like that's the key thing. Trying to drop as much as that passive. I mean, I still fall back into it sometimes, right?
Me too, yeah.
And so it's just being. That's why you need to step away, look at the text, and be like, am I using passive voice? Like there's a moment. Check your 5 Ws. Check your language. Use a thesaurus. Check for good strong verbs, and edit out all of that passive voice.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.